Children. Coal dust settled in her lungs the morning they handed her over for a dead man's debt. 22 years old. Children. Opal Finch stood in the doorway of the Hargrove Mining Company office, with a flour sack of clothes pressed against her ribs and nothing else to show for her whole life. Children. The camp had given her 3 days before she'd come crawling back down the mountain. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about almost everything. Children. The number she couldn't stop thinking about was $41.60. She'd seen it scratched into the corner of the ledger, her uncle pressed flat on Ezra Dunmore's desk, the precise sum of her father's outstanding debt to the Copper Ridge operation, accumulated over 2 years of broken equipment, borrowed wages, and cheap whiskey. Her uncle hadn't looked at her when he signed his name. Children. He'd stared at the water stain on the ceiling like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. Children. Ezra Dunmore was not a large man, which surprised her. Everything she'd heard about him in the camp suggested someone monstrous in scale. He was lean, though narrow-shouldered, with a face that had been hammered flat by weather and grief, and something harder than either. His hair was black shot through with iron gray. Children. He had 4 children by a woman who'd died of a hemorrhage 18 months prior, and the entire Copper Ridge operation ran on the understanding that nobody asked Ezra Dunmore personal questions. He paid his men fair. He didn't drink. He didn't gamble. He didn't speak unless he had something to say. Children. He looked at Opal across the desk for a long measuring moment and then said, "Can you cook on a wood stove?" Children. Yes. Children. The youngest doesn't sleep through the night. You'll be up. Children. All right. Children. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he's already moved on in his head. He picked up his hat from the corner of the desk and walked past her through the door. She followed because there was nothing else to do. Children. The wagon ride to the upper camp took 40 minutes on a road that deserved a harsher name than road. It was a rutted gash carved into the side of the mountain, barely wide enough for the mule and the cart, with a drop on the right side that Opal refused to look at directly. The trees pressed in close on the left, Douglas firs so tall and dark they blotted out the afternoon sky in long, cold stripes. Children. She sat in the back of the flat cart on a wooden crate because the bench up front only fit one, and Ezra drove without offering. Children. She used the 40 minutes to breathe slowly and list what she knew. Children. She knew the upper camp sat at 6,000 feet. She knew there were no other women within 4 miles. She knew the 4 children. She'd heard their names once in passing from the cook at the lower camp, were ages 14, 11, 7, and not yet 2. She knew the 14-year-old was a boy and the rest were girls. Children. She knew the boy had thrown a rock through the window of the company foreman's office 3 months ago, and Ezra had paid for the glass without a word of apology on the child's behalf. Children. She did not know what she was walking into. She understood that fully. Children. The upper camp was a cluster of 3 structures, a long bunkhouse for the unmarried miners that worked the secondary shaft, a storage building with a tin roof, and the house. Children. The house was substantial for a mining settlement. 2 stories of rough-cut timber, a covered porch, a stone chimney throwing a thin line of white smoke against the gray sky. Children. Someone had once planted something in a box nailed below the front window. Whatever it had been was long dead. Children. The wagon stopped. Before Ezra had wrapped the reins around the brake, the front door opened. Children. The boy stood on the porch with his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw set in a way that belonged on someone 30 years older. He was tall for 14, angular with his father's flat-hammered face, and a mouth pressed into a line of absolute judgment. Behind him, peering around his elbow, was a girl of 7 with her dark hair chopped unevenly at the jaw, Cut herself, Opal guessed, or had the boy do it. Children. Behind her, half hidden in the shadow of the doorframe, the 11-year-old stood very still, watching. Children. The 2-year-old was nowhere visible. Children. Who's that? The boy said, not a question. Children. Her name's Opal, Ezra said, stepping down from the cart. She'll be keeping the house. Children. We don't need anybody keeping the house. Children. Bennett? That was all, Ezra said. One word, flat and final, and something in the boy's posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Not backing down, exactly, but recalibrating. He looked at Opal with his father's pale eyes and the particular contempt of someone who has decided they don't like you before you've spoken. Children. Opal picked up her flour sack and climbed off the cart without assistance. Children. The 7-year-old ducked behind Bennett's arm. The 11-year-old, Opal would learn her name was Faye, had not blinked once. Children. Is there a room, Opal asked Ezra. Children. Off the kitchen small. Children. That's fine. Children. She walked up the porch steps past all 3 of them and pushed the door open herself. Children. The smell was the first thing, not as catastrophic as it might have been. Someone was keeping the worst of it at bay. But stale, heavy with the particular staleness of a house where nobody opens windows. Children. Where wet wool and iron cookware and child sweet and sawdust have been accumulating for months without a hand to clear them. The main room held a table, 6 chairs, a cold hearth. Children. And a chaos of objects arranged with the logic of people who had stopped seeing the mess. Boots on the table. Children. A bridle hanging over the back of a chair, tin cups in a stack that had toppled and not been restacked, a child's drawing nailed to the wall above the fireplace, curling at the corners. Children. Opal stood in the center of the room. Children. The 2-year-old was asleep on the floor behind the settle, curled on a folded horse blanket, with her fist jammed in her mouth. She had hair the color of copper pennies and eyelashes that fanned against her round cheeks like something from a painting. Children. Opal set her bag down on the table, moved the boots to the floor, and went to find the kitchen. Children. The first week was not cruel in any dramatic way. It was cruel in the way that grinding stone is cruel to the thing being ground. Children. Ezra left before light every morning to run the secondary shaft. He came home after dark, ate whatever Opal had made without comment, and disappeared into the small room off the back staircase. He did not thank her. He did not complain. He was simply absent even when he was present, in the way of men who have spent a long time carrying grief they won't name. Children. The children were another calculation entirely. Children. Bennett, the boy, was not loud about his war with her. He was surgical. He would do what she asked and do it wrong, precisely wrong, in ways that couldn't be directly blamed. Firewood stacked wet side up so it smoked. Water hauled from the wrong barrel so it tasted of iron. He'd answer her questions with one word and look at her afterward the way you look at something you're waiting to see fail. Children. Faye, the 11-year-old, simply disappeared whenever Opal entered a room. She moved through the house like smoke, gone before you could look directly at her. She wasn't hostile. She wasn't anything. She had folded herself inward sometime in the past 18 months, and nobody had found a way to pull her back out. Children. The 7-year-old was Bess, and Bess had decided Opal was a temporary inconvenience to be waited out. She watched her with the patient gravity of a child who has learned that adults come and go, and the smart thing is not to get attached. Children. The 2-year-old's name was Cora. Cora was indiscriminate in her affections. She would hold the hands of anyone who stood still long enough, and she was the only one who made Opal feel like something more than furniture. Children. Opal scrubbed. She aired the wool blankets over the porch rail and beat them until the dust came off in visible clouds. She restacked the firewood properly. Children. She found 3 dead mice behind the flour bin and disposed of them without ceremony. Children. She cooked cornmeal porridge and salt pork and whatever Ezra brought back from the company commissary without complaint, and she served it on clean plates, and nobody said thank you, children, and she didn't expect them to. Children. What broke the surface tension was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a bowl of butter. Children. She had traded 2 hours of mending for the mining cook, darning socks for 6 of the unmarried men, her fingers cramped and raw afterward, in exchange for a pound of fresh butter. She came home and made cornbread with it, real cornbread, the kind that went golden and crumbled when you cut it, and smelled of something warm and deliberate. Children. She set the pan on the table for supper. Children. Bess stared at it. Then she looked up at Opal, then back at the pan. She reached out and touched the edge of the cornbread with one finger like she wasn't sure it was real. Children. Is that butter? Bess said. Children. Yes. Children. Bess looked at her brother. Bennett was looking at the cornbread with the same expression, though he killed it quickly when he noticed Opal watching. Children. Where'd you get it? He said flat. Children. I mended for the lower camp cook. Children. A pause. Something moved through Bennett's face that he didn't want her to see. He picked up his fork. Children. He ate 2 pieces. He didn't say anything about it. But that night, when Opal went out to the porch to haul in the last of the firewood before the temperature dropped, she found it already stacked inside the door, neatly, dry side up. Children. She didn't mention it in the morning. Children. The sickness came in the dead of October, when the first real snow had sealed the road to the lower camp under 8 inches of ice, crusted white. Ezra was 3 days into a run at the main shaft with the full crew, sleeping in the lower bunkhouse to avoid the daily climb. The mountain was locked and quiet. Children. Opal woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of Faye breathing. Children. She knew before she was fully conscious that it was wrong. She'd grown up in a mining camp. She knew what wrong breathing sounded like, the wet, labored pull of lungs fighting themselves, the catch and drag of something thicker than air. Children. She was up the stairs before she'd put her boots on. Children. Faye was curled on her side in the narrow iron bed, her face flushed a deep, unnatural red, and her chest pulling in ragged, uneven stutters. Her lips had gone slightly blue at the corners. The room smelled of fever, that hot animal smell like pennies and steam. Children. Opal pressed her hand to the girl's forehead. She pulled it back fast. Children. Bennett was standing in the doorway. She didn't know when he'd appeared. He was barefoot in his sleep shirt, and the expression on his face was the first fully honest thing she'd seen from him. It was terror. Children. She does this, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way he couldn't stop. She did this the same night before he stopped. Children. Before his mother died. Opal understood without needing to hear it. Children. How long has she been like this? Children. I don't know. I heard her when I got up for water. Children. Opal made a decision in the space of a breath. There was no doctor within 6 miles on a cleared road. The road was not cleared. There was no way to reach Ezra before morning at the earliest. There was her, and there was whatever was in this house. Children. Get the fire built up as hot as you can make it, she told Bennett. Both stoves. I need steam. Children. He moved immediately. No argument, no hesitation, just the solid sound of his bare feet on the floorboards going down the stairs fast. Children. She worked through the rest of the night. She boiled water in the 2 largest pots she could find and draped a wool blanket over Faye and the steaming basin, holding the girl's shoulders when she fought it. Children. Talking low and steady through the thrashing. She ground the dried eucalyptus she'd found in the back of the kitchen shelf. Left, she guessed, children, by Faye's mother, into a rough powder and let it steep in the boiling water. Children. She made Fay drink willow bark tea a spoonful at a time, holding her head up with one hand and waiting for each swallow. Children. Bennett kept the fires. He hauled wood without being asked, feeding both stoves through the dark hours, so that by 4 in the morning the house was sweltering and every window had sheeted with condensation. When Opal came downstairs for more water at some point after midnight, she found Bess sitting on the bottom stair in her nightgown, hugging her knees, watching the door. "Children, go back to bed," Opal told her. "Children." "No," Bess said simply. "Children." Opal didn't have the energy to argue. She left her there. "Children." By dawn, the blue had gone from Fay's lips. Her breathing was still rough, but it had found a rhythm, uneven, ragged, but regular. The fever had dropped 1 degree, then another. Opal sat on the floor beside the bed with her back against the wall and her knees pulled up to her chest, too tired to move to the chair, listening to each breath come and go. Children. She didn't notice when she fell asleep. Children. She woke to a hand on her shoulder. Children. Ezra was crouched beside her, still in his outdoor coat, snow melting off the brim of his hat and dropping onto the floorboards. His face was a landscape of exhaustion and something that hadn't found its shape yet. He smelled of cold air and pine pitch and the metal tang of the shaft. Children. He looked at Fay, asleep and breathing smoothly now, her color coming back. Children. He looked at Opal. Children. One of the men from the lower bunkhouse came to get me, he said quietly. Said the boy had come down in the dark asking for, he said you were up all night. Children. She's past the worst of it. Opal's voice came out rougher than she intended. The fever needs to keep dropping. She shouldn't move for at least 2 days. Children. Ezra was still looking at her. He had a way of looking at things that was unsettling, not because it was unkind, but because it was so complete, like he was reading past the surface into the wiring underneath. Children. You should sleep, he said. Children. I'll sleep when Cora wakes up and needs breakfast. Children. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll take Cora. Children. It was such a plain, quiet statement, and so entirely out of character with everything she had assumed about him, that she didn't have an immediate response. Children. She looked up at him. The first time she'd looked at him directly, really, without defensiveness or assessment. The lines around his eyes were deep and permanent. His jaw was rough with several days of growth. He looked like a man who had been carrying weight for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. Children. He reached over and pulled the extra blanket from the chair and draped it over her shoulders. Children. Sleep, he said again. Children. He left the room. She heard him go down the stairs, heard the low register of his voice saying something to the children below. Then nothing. She pulled the blanket up around her neck and leaned her head back against the wall. Children. When she woke, 3 hours later, the house smelled of coffee and something frying, and she could hear Cora in the kitchen laughing at something. That particular 2-year-old laughter, startled and whole, like bells shaken once. Children. December sealed them in completely. The road was gone under 4 feet of hard-packed snow and the passes had closed. Children. They were 6 people in a timber house on the side of a mountain with what was in the larder and what wasn't. Children. Opal took stock the first week of December and did the arithmetic she didn't want to do and came to an arrangement with it. They would eat less. She would stretch further. Children. Nobody would know the math was close until it stopped being close. Children. Bennett figured it out by Christmas. Children. She knew because he started leaving things. A brace of rabbits hung on the back porch hook 2 mornings in a row. A sack of dried beans that had not been there before. Children. Which she was reasonably sure he'd traded something for with one of the unmarried miners from the bunkhouse. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. Children. They operated in this parallel silence for weeks, her stretching the larder, him quietly adding to it. And it worked, and the children ate enough. Children. On the Sunday before Christmas, Bess asked Opal if she knew any songs. Children. It came out of nowhere in the flat, declarative way Bess had with questions. They were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, Bess supposedly doing the letter practice Opal had been slowly insisting on, Opal mending a tear in Ezra's work shirt. Children. A few, Opal said. Children. Our ma used to sing on Sundays, Bess said it matter-of-factly, with the careful neutrality of a child who has practiced saying something hard until it sounds easy. Children. Opal looked at her for a moment. What kind of songs? Children. Old ones, the kind without words you have to know. Children. Hymns. Children. I think so. Children. Opal set the shirt down. She thought about it. She was not a natural singer and had never pretended to be, but she knew the shape of the old hymns, the way you know something you've heard in doorways and from the next room, and in the gray light of early mornings your whole life. Children. She started with the simplest one she knew. Her voice was flat in places, and she lost the melody twice and had to find it again. But Bess sat across the table with her letter practice, forgotten, and her hands folded in her lap and her eyes very bright. And by the second verse, she was mouthing the words she half remembered. Children. Faye appeared in the kitchen doorway. Children. She stood there for the whole song, not speaking, not coming in. When it ended, she looked at the floor and went back upstairs. But she'd come to the doorway. That was something. Children. Ezra was in the main room. He had not moved for the duration. When Opal came through a few minutes later to bank the fire, he was sitting with a piece of uncarved wood in his hands, looking at nothing in particular. He glanced at her. Children. She liked the third verse best, he said quietly, his wife. He didn't say it, but it was there. Children. Opal nodded once and let it sit. Children. Spring came in March, and then left again, and then came back for real in April, in a rush of mud and snowmelt, and the sound of water running somewhere under everything. The road opened. The passes cleared. The world below Copper Ridge remembered it existed. Children. Ezra told her one evening that he needed to go to the supply office in Ridgecrest, the nearest actual town, 12 miles and a mountain pass away. He said it the way he said most things, as information, not invitation. Children. I need to come, Opal said. Children. He looked at her. Children. There's a list of things I can't get from the commissary, she said, and I need to speak to the dry goods man about his salt prices, because he's been overcharging your account for 3 months, and I found the receipts. Children. A pause. Something in the vicinity of amusement crossed his face without quite committing to an expression. Children. 6 o'clock, he said. Children. The wagon ride to Ridgecrest was an hour through country that had turned improbably green overnight, the kind of green that makes you forget what winter looked like. Opal sat on the bench beside Ezra. Children. They didn't speak much, which was no different from usual, except that the quality of the silence had changed. It was not the silence of two strangers. Children. It had texture to it now, a winter's worth of shared mornings and shared fire and shared worry. Children. Ridgecrest was larger than she expected, or larger than she'd remembered from the one time she'd passed through it as a child. A proper main street, 2 saloons, a church with white paint peeling at the corners, a hotel. People on the boardwalks. Children. They stopped in front of the Mackey Dry Goods. Ezra wrapped the reins and stepped down, and he offered his hand. Children. It was such a simple thing. She took it. She stepped down, her boots finding the mud of the main street, and she let go. Children. The man behind the counter at Mackey's was a heavy-set, cheerful person who had the look of someone accustomed to being the most important individual in the building. He greeted Ezra first, with the particular warmth of a man greeting a good account, and then looked at Opal with a slightly confused smile. "Children. And who's this?" "Children. Opal Finch," she said. "I keep house up at the Copper Ridge Upper Camp." She opened her notebook. She'd kept meticulous records. "Children. Learned it from watching the company bookkeeper and laid it flat on the counter. I need to talk to you about your salt pricing. You've been billing the Copper Ridge account at 11 cents per pound." "Children. The rate in your own catalog from last October is 8.5. That's a difference of." "Children. Now hold on." "Children. $47.20 across the winter." She tapped the column of figures. "I'd like it corrected on the account, and I'd like today's order priced at 8.5. "Children. The man opened his mouth and looked past her to Ezra with the expression of a man appealing a decision to a higher authority. "Children." Ezra crossed his arms. He didn't speak. "Children." The man looked back at Opal's notebook. He looked at the figures. He looked at Ezra one more time and found nothing helpful there. "Children. I'll have to check my records," he said. "Children. I'll wait," Opal said pleasantly. "Children." She got the credit. She got the corrected pricing. She got everything on her list at the rate it was supposed to be, packed into 3 canvas sacks that Ezra loaded into the wagon without comment. "Children." When they were back on the bench with the horses pointed toward the mountain, she could feel him looking at her from the side. "Children." $47, he said finally. "Children, and 20 cents. "Children." Another silence. The horses found their rhythm on the road. "Children." "You've been keeping records since November," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Children. Since I got there." "Children." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I didn't ask you to do that." "Children." "No." "Children. Why did you?" "Children." Opal looked at the road ahead of them. The mountain was still snow-capped at the top, but the lower slopes were coming alive. Patches of early wildflowers in the rocky cuts beside the road, the pale gold green of new growth on the firs. "Children." "Because it needed doing," she said, "and because I was there." "Children." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice had that quality it got sometimes, lower, quieter, stripped of the particular flatness he used when he was just transmitting information. "Children." "The children," he said. There, he stopped, started again. "Faye came down to breakfast on her own this morning." "Children." Opal had noticed. "Children." "She's been coming down more," Opal said. "Children." "Since November." He said it the same way she'd said it to him, since the sickness. Since the night that changed what they were to each other. "Children." "She's going to be all right," Opal said. "They all are." "Children." Ezra nodded, looking at the road. "Children." "Bennett's going to push back at everything for another 2 years at least," she added. "He's got a lot of himself to protect." "Children." The corner of Ezra's mouth moved almost. "That's not wrong." "Children." "He's a good boy underneath all the armor. He kept those fires going all night and didn't ask for anything in return and didn't tell anyone he'd done it. That's not armor. That's character." "Children." She felt Ezra go still beside her in that particular way he had. Not a visible stillness, but an interior one, like a pool going quiet. "Children." "His mother used to say something like that about him," Ezra said. He said it carefully, the way you say something you haven't said out loud in a long time, testing whether it still holds its shape. "Children." "She sounds like she was sharp," Opal said. "Children." "The sharpest." He paused. "You would if she would have liked you. She had no patience for nonsense either." "Children." It was not a declaration. It was something quieter and more durable than a declaration, an admission, slow and deliberate, offered the way Ezra Dunmore offered everything. Without drama, without softness, with the full weight of someone who means exactly what he says. "Children." Opal looked at the road. "Children." The mountain rose ahead of them, massive and permanent and already feeling, in the complicated way of things you didn't choose, like home. Children. Tell me about her, Opal said. Children. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not. Then he shifted the reins in his hands, and his voice came out measured and careful and alive in a way she hadn't heard it before. Children. Her name was Ruth, he said. She hated winter and loved it anyway. She could read Bennett better than I ever could. She planted sweet peas in that box under the window the spring before she died. Children. I'll plant them again this year, Opal said, if you tell me where she kept the seeds. Children. The wagon rolled on, up the mountain. The horses breathed steam into the cold air. Somewhere ahead, through the tree line, the house sat, with its cold hearth, and its 4 children and its dead window box, and its entire complicated future waiting to be worked out one season at a time. Children. Opal Finch leaned back against the wooden seat and breathed in the smell of pine and wet earth and the leather of Ezra's coat, and she thought about $41.60 and what it had bought and what it hadn't and what had grown up anyway in the spaces between. Children. It wasn't a story with a clean ending. It was a house on a mountain with a roof that needed new shingles before fall, and a 14-year-old who would push back for another 2 years at least, and a 2-year-old who laughed like bells, and a man who had finally said his wife's name out loud. Children. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the end, everything. Children. I keep thinking about that flour sack. Everything Opal owned, pressed against her ribs, and not one person in that office looked her in the eye when they signed the paper. $41.60. That number stays with me because it's so specific, so small, and so completely wrong as a measure of what a person is worth. Children. What I've come to understand, turning this story over the way you turn a stone to see what's living underneath, is that what happened to Opal wasn't just about survival. It was about what a person chooses to do with a situation they didn't choose. She didn't set out to save anyone. She didn't walk into that mountain camp with a plan to win anyone over. Children. She just kept showing up, kept the fire fed, kept the records, kept the children breathing, because the work was in front of her and she was the one standing there. That's not heroism in the dramatic sense. That's something quieter and harder to name. It's the decision, made over and over in small moments, to do the right thing even when nobody's watching and nobody's going to thank you for it. Children. And that's what I think about when I think about Opal's character. Not the moment she stood her ground in Mackey's dry goods, though I love that moment, but the night she spent on the floor beside Faye's bed, keeping track of every breath, when she could have made a reasonable argument for going back to sleep and hoping for the best. She didn't, not because someone was evaluating her. Children. Because she understood in that clear and unsentimental way she had that the child needed someone to stay, and she was the someone who was there. Children. That's what I'd call moral clarity, the kind that doesn't need an audience. Children. And then there's the notebook. The record she'd been keeping since November. That detail stops me every time, because it tells you everything about how Opal's mind worked. She didn't just endure. Children. She paid attention. She tracked the salt prices and the firewood and the patterns of the children, and she built, over months, children. A body of knowledge that nobody asked her for, and that turned out to matter enormously. The $47.20 she recovered from Mackey's wasn't luck. Children. It was the return on sustained, patient, careful thinking applied to a problem most people would have ignored. Intelligence used in the service of people who needed it. That's not a small thing. Children. And Bennett. I think about Bennett hauling wood in the dark and not saying a word about it. Opal was right. That's not armor. That's character being built in the hardest possible conditions. Children. The grit it took for that boy to choose to help someone he decided to hate, and choose it quietly, without credit. That's the same quality Opal had. Children. The willingness to keep going when giving up would be so much easier, and no one would blame you for it. Children. What the mountain gave all of them eventually was each other, not as a gift. As a consequence of showing up every morning and doing the work. Children. I think that's how it actually goes. Not a reward handed down for good behavior, but a result that grows, slowly and without announcement, out of the accumulation of honest choices. $41.60 bought a transaction. What Opal built in that house on Copper Ridge, that was hers. Every bit of it.